Night leaves the desert like a curtain drawn back by a careful hand, revealing a stage of chalked lines and low, wary earthworks. The fortress has no turrets in stone, only geometry wire running like barbed script, anti-tank ditches gouged into a collar, sangars crouched as if in prayer. This is the box, not a myth but a perimeter of intent, a ring of posts stitched together by minefields and the nerves of men who have learned to measure distance with breath. The sand remembers everything and forgives nothing. Far out, where the dunes furl into glare, engines cough into readiness, the Afrika Korps waking in its long, lean body. The spear made of moving parts. A duel of archetypes is already written in the morning air. Fortress and blade, anvil and traveling hammer, patience against reach. The role of the fortress is endurance. Inside the ring, the city of Tobruk hunkers like a stubborn thought, its harbor clenched around piers that creak with the promise of nights to come. The garrison moves according to the grammar of siege Australians, with sun-bitten cheekbones and a humor that hacks through fear like a machete. British gunners with wrists burned the color of varnish. Sappers who treat the ground as a book worth annotating. Poles whose exile has hardened into a vow. They are given a circumference and a ledger, shells in and shells out. Rations counted by fingers that tremble only in cold. Water tallied like a sacrament. You are asked to look past the press photographs and feel the relentless arithmetic of staying. Beyond the wire, reach is an ethic. The German columns unfurl with insect clarity. Scout cars thin as opinions. Half-tracks trotting like obedient hounds. Guns clipped behind trucks. Tanks coming on last with the satisfaction of cats. The desert loves men who understand horizon as currency. It becomes complicit with the long-range thrusts, compass headings, fuel cans rattling like deliberate dice, a doctrine that pronounces distance not as obstacle, but as ally. The Afrika Korps presents the old myth wearing a new face speed as strategy, surprise as sermon. A general in goggles and avatar more than a man leans over a map pinned by stones and speaks in arrows. The arrow is a promise not to smash the box head on, but to bend the world around it until the hinge cracks. Under the sun's judicial glare, the first feelers test the perimeter. Armored cars probe the posts, their machine gun chatter like a bad joke told too loudly. The reply is not romance, but craft a gun, layers hand steadies on a traversing wheel. A loader's shoulder learns again the weight of a shell that can rewrite distance. A telephone line carries a whisper, 2 posts down, wait, now. When the 25-pounders answer, their concussive syllables teach the sand to remember new verbs. Where the enemy had hoped to find the character for collapse, he meets persistence written in dirt. The fortress learns to be a creature. Its posts are not dots, they are senses. Each watches, sniffs, listens through the wire for the wheel song of approach, the punctuation of a track clatter that does not match yesterday's. At noon, a dust plume blooms and resolves into Italian tanks, squat shapes in a skin of paint flaky as old laws. Ariete pugnacious ram comes up in courage, if not in confidence. And for a while, the day tilts toward legend. Matilda the Sins nose forward with the mercy of iron priests. Heavy footsteps that neither quick nor clever tactics can cancel at short range. Anti-tank crews taste the metallic tang of inevitability. A Matilda shoulders an Italian gun into silence. A bayonet word is spoken briefly at a trench line and then swallowed by the desert's disinterest. The afternoon finishes with an old truth armor that is brave without friends, dies as history's correction. But out beyond sight, the blade is circling. Long columns have run west to meet an eastward thought, leaping past the box toward the Egyptian frontier, stabbing at Solemn and Halfaya, the way a storyteller reorganizes chronology to improve the tale. They are not here to gnaw at the wire. They are here to make the wire irrelevant. The garrison feels it like a change in air pressure. The jock columns improvised, hungry. Mobile skitter out from the box's edges like sparks. Little fists of carriers. Portés with guns lashed to truck beds. A few cruiser tanks scowling at heat. They are the counter myth that a fortress can grow legs. Each thrust and parry writes marginalia on the main argument. Buying hours with petrol, minutes with sweat, night trains the ear. Across the harbor, the Tobruk ferry begins its exhale destroyers and sloops sliding in, black as the between notes of a song, hugging the reef like conspirators. Crates marked in languages that agree only on urgency kiss the wharf, are seized by hands that do not drop them, and find their way into the city's hunger. Wounded go out with faces that have learned a second childhood, spare barrels, tins, and rumor come in. The ferry is the fortress's quiet heart. When you imagine siege, imagine this instead: a gangway with boots on it, a whispered tally in a notebook, the smell of rope, salt, and stubbornness. Dawn again, and the blade has learned a new approach. Not frontal, never frontal, if it can help it, but a quick knuckle at a soft point. A feint at the southern post while guns north of the Bardia Road argue in calibers. The desert lends its glare. Mirage turns friend and enemy into variants of heat. At a forward post, a listening soldier watches a lizard choose the shade under a captured helmet and grasp. For one absurd second, the equality of creatures. Then 88s begin to speak, the dry cough of expertise. Their shells come flat and dishonorable, punching loopholes in sandbags as if interrogating them. The two-pounders snap back with their small, vicious authority. An Australian sergeant decides that holding is now a matter of inches and repositions his world accordingly. Long-range war demands a new psyche. For the Corps, it is faith in maps and the ability to read dust. For the box, it is intimacy with the ground and a familiarity with fear that does not flaunt itself. The garrison becomes nocturnal where it can, diurnal where it must. Overhead, vultures write parenthetical commentary no one requested. In their shade, men learn the mind's thin line, how to become hard enough to resist and soft enough to bend without breaking. The fortress archetype is not granite, it is willow with a spine. At intervals, the desert coughs up theater. A reconnaissance party returns with a truck dressed in enemy kit, flags folded into pockets, goggles wearing foreign dust. They have danced with risk and brought home a small proof that the blade can be nicked. Another time, a German column, mistaking number for narrative, crashes at speed into a minefield disguised as ordinary. The ground speaks in small thunderclaps. Tracks rise and fall without vehicles attached to them. For a minute, the desert applauds and then resumes its habit of indifference. The lesson is not triumph, but calibration. Every thrust must be measured against a geometry of wire and will. Inside the box, humor grows barbed and useful. Rats, they call themselves, embracing the insult until it loses teeth. Creatures of night and hole, hard to starve, harder to extirpate. An archetype is born not the shining knight or the granite guardian, but the survivor, clever and communal. In dugouts lined with corrugated iron, boiled tea becomes a ritual of sovereignty. Faces smudged with cordite grin at absurdities, a donkey wearing a gas mask in a photograph. A signpost pointing to London and nowhere. A shell labeled, "To whom it may concern." You may think such details small. A siege knows them as planks in a bridge over days that would otherwise not connect. The blade refuses to be static. Deep thrusts drop a hook behind the box and tug. Fuel becomes the blood of intention. At Bir el Gubi and along the Trig Capuzzo, the doctrine of reach finds both its eloquence and its limits. Empty cans rattle like hollow promises. Engines that were lions at dawn become house cats at dusk, purring on fumes. The box senses the strain. Raids sprint outward like the tongue of a lizard. Burn a dump, drag back prisoners whose eyes have seen too much horizon, and sprint home before the sky learns their names. The fortress has arms. The desert allows them only certain lengths. Heat builds until the light feels solid. Men speak less because words evaporate before they can be drunk. In that silence, the siege matures. Guns are shifted by night to places where habit had not thought to look. New mine belts are seated with the attentiveness of gardeners who know they must live in their own plots. A patrol finds a shallow wadi that offers a novel angle. A telephone exchange that tangled yesterday now hums like a disciplined hive. The box evolves not by epiphany, but by accretion of craft. Its oldest magic is continuity, the willingness to learn the desert's unkind syllabus and pass the exam one morning at a time. You who prefer decisive curves of arrows on maps must endure the slow psychology of this argument. It is not won by a single charge, but by refusing the enemy the story he prefers. The Afrika Korps loves surprise. The box, by surviving surprise, makes it ordinary. Reach wants to starve the ring. The ring, by learning to eat at night and mend by day, denies starvation its drama. Heroism here is tire changing at 1 a.m. under blackout cloth, while listening for a gear you cannot afford to strip. The myth is simple. The method is pure. As dusk lays down its brown shawl, the harbor draws breath again. The ferry ghosts in. A child's voice, memory, or mirage drifts from a house that has traded people for pigeons. The lighthouse stands like an unblinking witness. Somewhere far out, engines thrum an answer that will not arrive in time to matter tonight. The guns on the perimeter cycle through their last corrections, then fall quiet except for the small cough of a mortar, placing commas in the dark. The fortress sleeps badly and well. The blade unrolls another map upon its bonnet beneath a sky rehearsing infinity. Tomorrow's thrust will come from an angle that seems new but isn't. The box will flex where it must and harden where it can. The desert, its only honest ally, will favor neither. In that tension lies the next act, the long-range reach gambling against the stubborn circumference. Both discovering what endurance means when measured in petrol tins, tea leaves, and the private arithmetic of fear. The curtain does not fall. It is tugged a little farther back to reveal a road, a mine, a trench lip, a joke, a howl. The siege continues with the patience of stone taught to move. The sun climbs like a slow coin, the sort of gold that buys obedience from flies and silence from men. By noon, the box shimmers, a necklace of posts sunk into stone and chalk, each bead its own small republic of habit. The perimeter breathes through narrow throats, camouflaged bays where guns wait like coiled grammar, shallow sangars bristling with the bric-a-brac of siege, pits dark with the varnish of used oil. Inside the ring, the harbor curls its steel tongue around the battered piers. A schooner's mast ghosts the skyline like a memory that refuses to be filed. The fortress archetype settles deeper into itself, rat-like resilience, communal humor, sensual loyalty to routine. You are dared to understand that heroism here is a ledger kept with greasy fingers, a rhythm of rationed tins, a shade net repaired with twine and patience, a water jar cradled as if it were a child. Beyond the wire, daylight lengthens into a runway for intent. The Afrika Korps exerts its long-range philosophy as a liturgy of motion reconnaissances drawn thin as needlework, columns strung along the Via Balbia with the audacity of tourists who have decided to own the road. Out in the interior, where a mirage raises blue cities that vanish at a blink, the blade gathers its breath for thrusts that aspire to make geometry weep. Two myths fence, one of stone that grows roots, one of steel that sprouts wings. The desert, disdainful god that it is, lends itself to both and promises fidelity to neither. The first hard argument of the day is pointed at a place whose name feels like a prescription, Halfaya. A cliff lifts its lip to show the coast road, and in the notch called Hellfire, a new grammar speaks. 88s are posted like stern tutors at the head of class, their long fingers pointing out mistakes at ranges that seem indecent. The allied reliefs that have been rehearsed in polygons on blackboards now must cross a threshold where every angle is remembered. Cruisers and Matildas, their faces chapped by wind and overwork. Nose in. Porte two-pounders bob and hold steady with a faith that feels like hunger's cousin. The first minutes write tragedy in simple sentences. Armor that believes in courage as a solvent learns that some rocks do not dissolve. Courage must therefore change shape. At the box, news travels along wire like a nervous system trained not to betray. Signals offices become the brain of endurance, headphones pressed, pencils poised, call signs recited in a catechism of consonants. The posts neither tremble nor relax, they flex. A jock column goes out brisk, undergunned, intrepid, its carriers loaded with nerve, its portees lashed with the elegance of desperate carpentry. They skim over flats where sunlight seems to have a smell. They dip into wadis that record, in shade and goat track, the private history of tribes and the public one of armies. In the distance, a dust column writes a paragraph of threat across the horizon. The column commander reads that paragraph and chooses an adverb fast. The raiders are the box's legs, but the box remains a torso built to receive blows and exhale them as jokes. In a dugout lined with corrugated iron, a kettle patrol boils tea that tastes of shell casing and mint. A photograph of a woman taped to the side of a Vickers stares back with the numb patience of both muse and mirage. A sign over a trench mouth reads Tivoli, and men laugh because naming is a way to lay claim. The rats of Tobruk, embracing the insult until it becomes an armor plate, compose a new song of siege move in the dark. Mend in the dawn, make the day expensive for anyone with plans. You are reminded that endurance is not passive, it hunts. Through afternoon's magnifying glass, the long-range doctrine plays its score. Far behind the ring, trucks bounce toward emptiness to plant a hook in the Allied rear. At Sidi Rezegh and near Fort Capuzzo, columns trade punches in the language of petrol and bearings, a syntax where the verb to break applies to both momentum and axles. Reconnaissance becomes a sacrament. A lieutenant with a sunburnt wrist flicks sand from a compass and becomes for 10 seconds the axis of a continent. The blade's genius is to put pressure where the box is not. The box's answer is to become larger without moving a mind that reaches by rumor and raiding in the harbor's nightly lungs. When evening leans in, the sea takes a breath and passes it ashore. The Tobruk ferry ghosts its hulls through a punctuation of reefs and buoys, escorted by destroyers who smell of salt, smoke, and prophecy. Shapes hurry in blackout batteries for radios, spares for guns and bodies, boots that remember other roads. Wounded slide out with the gentlest violence war knows. Fresh units step in with the politeness of men, joining a conversation already at its third glass. The ferry is a vein that lies too close to the skin. The enemy knows and reaches for it with night bombers that circle like moths with cruel ideas. But the reef and the discipline of men who know their own shadows keep the path open. And the box wakes each dawn slightly richer in possibility than it deserved to be. Dawn also brings flies, a blizzard of them, like black confetti stuck to sweat and intention. Sun nets ripple, eyes narrow until the landscape is a line drawing of menace and necessity. Health becomes a tactic. Those who understand water discipline as theology live to trade, fight, and carry. Those who don't become paragraphs in other men's lectures about how to stay. Humor retracts and returns. The box's gunners develop a scholar's loathing for the long, flat crack of the 88 and a craftsman's love for the throaty boom of a 25-pounder perfectly fused. The blade's gunners count shells as arguments, saving certain tones for those matinee duels when a portée silhouette breaks the mirage and refuses to disappear. Some days offer staged illusions. A German dash to the wire blurs past a listening post, vehicles hooping the horizon like thrown bracelets. And the men at the post feel the old panic twitch in the spine. Are we behind? Are we surrounded? Are we now logistics for someone else's map? But the dash strands itself on the arithmetic of the desert cans empty. Tires shred, bearings heat. A raid from the box reaches out, burns a petrol stack into a bouquet of black roses, and is back across the wire before the smoke learns its lines. You, the spectator, want climaxes. The desert hands you cancellations, rehearsals, and the slow accrual of competence. Some afternoons, the blade does knock on the front door for practice, for morale, because a siege insults the temperament of men who believe the future is a straight road. Tanks mass in the southern sector and drive toward posts labeled in letters that sound like wagers, R33, R35, while guns and cuttings crack their knuckles. In the dust theater, Matildas emerge again with dogged chins. Crusaders run like horses who think they have remembered how to be wild. At short range, every doctrine throws off its cloak and grasps at the oldest law, who will stand this minute. The minebelts hum their treachery. A single lane cut by sappers becomes the entire universe for a troop commander whose map is now his peripheral vision. Posts bend and straighten, bend and straighten. When the line settles back, it is not exactly where it was, it is nearer to knowledge. The desert teaches omnivorous lessons. In the quiet between salvos, a goat herd wanders at the edge of vision. An undecodable note in the stanza of war. A lorry driver whispers to his engine as if to a child. A chaplain writes a letter for a hand that can no longer grip a pencil. Italians fight like men who wish the past were gentler. Germans like men with a bet on modernity. Australians like men who find laughter easier than home. Britons like men who believe boredom might yet win. Poles like men who have memorized exile. The box collects them into a choir that sings only 2 words, not yet. On the 8th day of a week counted only by shells, a sandstorm comes, a letter from the desert to the quarrelers. Vision becomes rumor. Compasses spin their tiny spines. The box sighs gratitude for a cover that costs no ammunition. The blade, frustrated, idles, burns, waits. Somewhere under the brown howl, a patrol huddles in a wadi and shares a cigarette with a captured driver who wears dust of the same composition. For an hour, the archetypes blur fortress and thrust reduced to the same human huddle, the same dryness of mouth, the same prayer that vehicles restart when the sky returns. When the veil lifts, both sides resume their roles with a touch more humility and a touch less haste. Night falls, bringing its brass orchestra of crickets and the velvet rasp of sea. The posts count noses and find enough. An artilleryman draws a chalk arc on the revetment to mark a traverse he will need at dawn. A sapper reburies a wire he knows he will dig up tomorrow. A runner tucks a message into a boot top like a family photograph. The Afrika Korps, leagues away, points noses toward the frontier again, crafting a plan that believes distance is a knife with an edge that never dulls. The box settles, not complacent, but certain in the one truth it has earned: endurance is a weapon when sharpened every evening. You are asked finally to look between the famous nouns and see the grammar of this campaign. Not victory and defeat, but until and unless. Not charge and rout, but arrive and stay. The fortress writes itself in the past continuous. The long-range thrust scrawls in the future imperative. The desert, ever the disinterested editor, returns pages with lines struck and margins annotated: fuel, water, shade, nerves. Another dawn waits with its ledger open. The box will answer with numbers and knuckles. The blade will reply with arrows and appetite. And between them, men will continue to invent small salvations, clean socks, fresh tins, quiet jokes without which no army holds or reaches for very long. Dawn opens like a book at its middle, pages already sweating salt. The box wakes to the same verbs check, tighten, count, yet each repetition adds a faint edge of cunning. Posts that were beads on a string become knuckles on a fist. Trench corners sharpen into memory. The garrison's humor dries into a blade you could shave with calling the worst dugout the Savoy, christening a blown-out truck the Greyhound, dubbing the mine belt the Promenade. Ritual is posture. Posture hardens into stance. The fortress archetype ripens less a wall than a low, stubborn creature that knows where to put its weight. Beyond the wire, the long-range creed keeps flexing. New arrows bloom on bonnets under an indifferent sky, one labeled with quick names, whispered like stage directions: brevity, battle axe. The blade rehearses its favorite trick: don't batter the hinge, unmake the doorframe. Halfaya's notch becomes a courtroom where flat-voiced judges deliver sentences at unkind ranges. Huffed Ridge out on the frontier rises like a patient knuckle and offers its own syllabus lines of panzers, holding still as theology until a cruiser shows a careless cheek, then moving with abrupt economy. The desert seems to reward the school that sits farther back and thinks longer thoughts. Brevity passes like an impatient sketch thrusts that touch the frontier line with fingers that hope to be fists. a brief flavor of success at the old stone posts. Then the flat, insolent cough of the 88 returning the chalk to the slate. Battle axe, more pronounced, tries to teach the same ground a different answer. Matildas go up the road with the fatal dignity of bishops. Blessings of armor undercut by speed that cannot draw breath on inclines. Crusaders hawk and surge along the flats like youths who mistake appetite for luck. The first hour looks like sermons fulfilled. Ariete blinking under the pressure, Italian guns confessing too easily. Then the ridge clears its throat and shows the review notes men should have read last month. A Porte's brave sliver of a silhouette snaps into black punctuation. A troop commander's world shrinks to a lane cleared through minds by sapper arithmetic. Stark minutes become an education that refuses romance. Inside the box, the learning is granular and unphotogenic. Sappers seed new belts with a care that looks like tenderness from afar. Gunners shift guns to places where yesterday would have sworn there was no room. Patrols map depressions and salt bushes as if cataloging a private language. Night raids grow teeth a handful of men slip across into the enemy's tidy neverlands. Leave a wire cut, a sentry missing, a rumor thick enough to breed restraint. Rats thrive in the imagination as much as in sand. The archetype of survivor acquires an aura the blade cannot spend away with reach. Midday heat seals tongues to teeth. Men talk in fragments that carry weight like sandbags. Stukas arrive high and step down the sky on iron legs. Sirens doing the work of theater, while bombs do the work of forgetting names. Bofors flicker like annoyed wasps. Machine guns stitch the air with habits that keep hands calm. The harbor endures the Luftwaffe's motive lecture. Wharf planks leap, oil catches, black fans bloom. And in the middle of it, a whaler bows to a swell and continues its idiot-perfect geometry toward the mole. The ferry is stubborn music, a rhythm section of keels and ropes and boots. Never quite on time, never truly late, always playing the next bar. At dusk, relief columns far away unspool along the escarpment, their destiny drifted by dust and a doctrine's faith in suddenness. The blade's genius is deposition fuel, then movement, then assertion. Yet every gallon becomes prophecy, and prophecy becomes risk. A jerry can that sloshes light writes a margin note in fate's ledger, deliver or die. The box senses this like weather and bones. Jock columns nibble. A night of petrol burned in the wrong gully becomes a day of quiet around the wire. The frontier posts themselves learn the desert sarcasm. Sidi Omar traded hands and learned to recognize the touch. Libyan Omar flirted with definitions. Fort Capuzzo changed sides like a character in a play who thinks he's the lead and discovers he's a hinge. Out at Hafid Ridge, the dual-turned scholastic Portes appear and vanish. Crews bouncing on leaf springs as if riding questions marks, while panzers hold their breath behind low ribs of earth and let the 88s recite. Courage is never absent. It is often misspent. A relief commander realizes too late that wisdom in this theater is not a fine gesture, but an inventory petrol, ammunition, water, light. Within the box, inventories are liturgy. A clerk with blistered thumbs counts tins as if absolving them. A sergeant medic writes in a small book the names of men who will need letters written, then blots the page with sand so the ink won't shine at night. A corporal of sappers sleeps with a reel of white tape at his chest the way other men once slept with a sweetheart's scarf. In a dugout, a sign reads, "No magnificent gestures," and its satire saves lives. You are asked to accept that stubbornness is a kind of artistry. Sometimes the blade cannot resist theater. A panzer wedge forms light screens out front, half tracks in cadence. 15th Panzer glittering with the cruel charisma of competence, and it rolls toward a southern court of posts where the ground is kinder and the line feels thinner. Dust makes its own evening. The first belts take their toll, little coughs of brown at the noses of vehicles. Then the smooth, polished crack of high-velocity truth. The wedge kinks but doesn't split. A troop of Matildas heaves into view, and the law of short range, old and universal, temporarily seizes the mic. For a quarter hour, the desert swallows time in huge mouthfuls guns at spitting distance. Men forgetting doctrine and remembering how to become narrow. Then the wedge folds, decides it has tested enough, and withdraws with that feline good manners German columns wear when they are conserving rather than conquering. The posts straighten, count hands, update jokes. A sandstorm drifts in like fatigue given weather. Visibility becomes a superstition. In the roar, a patrol from the fortress shelters in a shallow wadi with a lost dispatch rider from the enemy. Tea moves from one canteen to another, cigarettes swap allegiances. The men's eyes do not quite meet in a truce that will vanish with sightlines. When the sky falls back into its blue habit, each returns to his nouns: gun, truck, trench, and the general story resumes as if nothing had been learned. But something has. The archetypes are large. The creatures inside them are small and very alike. Beneath the blade's long sweeps, other knives go to work the deep-bellied trucks of the long-range desert group, sliding across somewhere south of certainty, scribbling on the Afrika Korps backstage with matches and compasses. Dumps burn in the night 200 miles from conversations. A road sign wakes up pointing the wrong way and ruins a schedule crafted by clever hands. These gestures do not alter the present tense of siege. They fatten its future. Reach meets reach. The myth of mobility becomes communal property. At Halfaya, the cliff keeps its sour smile. The relief that hoped to turn the lock breaks teeth on the mechanism. The box feels both the pain of distance and the pride of irreducible presence. Battle Axe, whose name promised what physics refused, comes home with a limp and a new respect for road grades, drift, and the grammar of gun pits. The Afrika Korps, whose doctrine invades evenings like a radio show everyone is trying to hear, congratulates itself on having proved again that arm's length is better than fist. The desert applauds by withholding rain. Night breathes out through the harbor and the men breathe in. Fresh spares, fewer shells than were wished for. Letters that smell of a rain a continent away. A tin of peaches produced at the exact moment a man needs to remember trees. The ferry departs with groaning decks, and sleek shadows follow her wake torpedoes or dolphins or rumors, and she outruns all three. AA cruise, half asleep, twitch at crank and fuse. In the raft of dark that remains, the rats tilt helmets back and let stars, in their expensive indifference, make everyone feel both tiny and gigantic. This is how a siege grows muscle. The box acquires timing patrols leave not when it's dramatic, but when the moon is where a sapper says it should be. Guns lift barrage by watch, not whim. Cooks swap tins between posts because calories are a tactic. The blade acquires skepticism, deep thrusts still tempt, but fuel tables glare, feints still amuse. But mine belts have multiplied like barbed arithmetic. The two myths waltz, step on each other, apologize, resume. You love a clean, perhaps cinematic solution. The desert keeps offering practice. Morning pulls its hard white over the line again. Cueing a new verse sung in familiar keys, reliefs humming far away. Squadrons harrying along the frontier. The box whispering to itself the catechism of endurance. In the distance, the map's future waits another name. A larger attempt. A winter that will sand the sharp edges off every doctrine. For now, the grammar is this: hold and harry, reach and ration, thrust and breathe. And in the middle of the sentence, minute by minute, men learn to believe in the small, practical mercies that leave a fortress standing when the long-range wind has spent itself against it. November arrives like a drumbeat felt through sand rather than heard. A rumor turning into an itinerary. The map acquires a new verb, crusader, and with it a promise that the stalemate will be broken not by flattery, but by effort. The box, which has spent months learning the art of staying, feels a change in pressure, a widening of the chest. Outside, the blade sharpens itself on compass roses and fuel tables. Rehearsing another long-range thesis, cut the siege by cutting the men who threaten to cut it. Two schools of belief prepare their syllabi: endurance promoted to action, mobility promoted to decision. The desert, unimpressed, polishes its glare. Far to the southeast, Armored brigades begin their careful geometry, New Zealanders measuring the escarpments with knuckles. South Africans threading beads of trucks along tracks that smell of hot metal and prayer. British cruisers tweaking carburetors for the sacrament of acceleration. At Bir el Gubi, Ariete braces for an exam it expects to fail and does not. Italian M13s, usually supporting actors in a German play, find their footing in dust and spite and hold, an anomaly that forces the narrative to slow down and look. This theater loves competence more than reputation. For a day, the ram charges and is not easily unseated. You are reminded that archetypes bend. The men inside them sometimes refuse to, northward, along a rise that looks ordinary until it is explained. Sidi Rezegh becomes a word with teeth. The ridge is nothing, a modest shelf of ground and a few scattered stones and everything. A view that can command roads and hopes. There the Afrika Korps chooses its favorite sentence, wait, then pounce. British armor, drawn thin by the appetite of many obligations, presents cheeks. 15th and 21st Panzer answer with cold grammar, firing from stillness, moving with parsimony, forbidding pursuit. The day named Totensonntag, Sunday of the Dead, writes itself in smoke spirals and silhouettes that fall and do not rise. A brigade's worth of men learn that courage offered to angles becomes arithmetic, and arithmetic frequently collects. Inside the box, the rats bare their own teeth. The 70th Division, tired of being a noun, becomes a verb breakout. Matilda's lead, chins down, the old bishops shouldering into a mine-riddled parish. Bayonets, which war has tried to relegate to ceremonial, briefly remember their purpose in trenches that had acquired names and habits. The posts of the eastern sector flower into motion wire parted, lanes chalked, mortars speaking in the intimate voice of short range. The breakout is not cinema, but carpentry, join this to that. Prop here, wedge there, push until a crack becomes a corridor. For an hour the desert feels small, a room with doors that can be forced. For a day, the box grows legs enough to step outside its circle and slap a surprised cheek. You, impatient for rescue, taste the flavor of agency and do not forget it. The blade, incensed, performs its favorite unkind trick. What is behind will be in front. A dash to the wire arcs again. An old gambit played with new cheek. German columns slit the map eastward and north, arrive deep in Egypt like uninvited guests who know the pantry's location, and threaten to convert Crusader into a cautionary tale. Petrol becomes prophecy and then accusation. Radios carry calm demands for speed that engines cannot always honor. Yet the long-range spell falters where it must fuel dumps do not always obey the schedule written for them. British columns do not always remain where geometry had predicted. A patrol blunders into an HQ and, for an absurd minute, captures conversations instead of positions. The desert smiles its toothless, pitiless smile at plans grown too linear. Sidi Rezegh refuses to be owned. The ridge passes between hands as if it were a shared tool. One day the Afrika Korps shapes it into a shelf for enfilade. The next, the New Zealand Division names its ridges and crawls along them with familial stubbornness. Air buries the hours in spirals of sand and shrapnel. Bofors clack. Stukas dive with theater and decision both. Kitty Hawk's scissor attack runs into stripes across the sky. On the ground, gun lines learn again that position is a verb. An anti-tank battery's life expectancy is measured in traverses and nerve. A chaplain moves along the wounded with a canteen and the economy of someone who understands triage as a kind of arithmetic of pity. The harbor listens and answers. The ferry increases its pulse more holes into that thin, perilous slit of water. More crates drag like stubborn children from decks to moles. More bicycles and jokes and the occasional piano key to remind men there are rooms somewhere else where music is not entirely shellfire. The Luftwaffe arrives to silence the metronome. The reef and discipline conspire again to preserve it. In the workshop caves, parts are married that were not born for each other. A Matilda receives an organ transplant from a wrecked carrier. A 25-pounder lives on the barrel of a cousin in the corner. A sign hung over a bench says, "Miracles performed." While you wait and is almost not a joke. Siege is a factory that turns ingenuity into hours. Crusader expands until the horizon looks crowded. Along the frontier, Hafid Ridge stages a seminar in restraint. At Sidi Omar, a stone fort learns how modernity digs. Between Capuso and the tree Capuso, arguments on wheels spread like vowels. The Afrika Korps attempts its favorite pivot, let the enemy overreach. Then close. The British attempt their favorite salvation, make two things happen at once, so the blade must choose. For a week, choice becomes the shape of the war. At Sidi Rezegh, choice says hold because the view is everything. At Bir el Gubi, choice says harry because holding misplaces faith. At the box, choice says push a corridor, then hold it open with teeth. The corridor becomes a question with moving parts. From the box, columns push out again, this time to touch a hand extended by the relief force like a rope stretched across water. Minds disagree, machine guns instruct. Matildas argue in their slow, rude tongue. A link-up flickers and dims, flares and peters. The desert resents conclusions. Still, for a handful of hours, a road exists that did not yesterday, and along it move things that alter morale as much as firepower boxes of rifle bolts and oily paper. Tins of bully for men whose bodies have turned to string. Letters that say nothing new and everything necessary. Faces that do not yet carry the desert's numbering. The rats grin without showing teeth. A fortress that can inhale is no longer only a noun. Rommel avatar now. Doctrine wearing goggles aims for the old solution unhinged by daring. His columns run in arcs that chew up daylight in the patience of clutches. They arrive hungry and leave angrier. Toten Sontag's lesson, though, proves less exportable than doctrine had hoped. British brigades return with scars and a refusal to disappear. South Africans reassemble from piles that look like endings. New Zealanders, bloodied, step forward again as if the ridge owed them interest. A headquarters falls under a patrol's untidy courage. Maps flutter. Typewriters learn silence. None of it is decisive. All of it is destabilizing. You, craving narrative, must bear with the desert's taste for sequences instead of scenes. Within the box, the breakout has left its after-image posts that had shrunk to habit feel larger for having moved. Men whose world had been measured in trenched lips and mind tapes now measure in miles, if only in dreams. The garrison's humor sharpens into prophecy. We'll be out by Christmas, someone says, and someone else answers. Which year not despair, but armor against disappointment. Artillery learns new timetables to match the dance outside. Counter battery becomes a gossip column written in smoke. Night-harassing guns whisper annoyance into bivouacs that believed in peace after dark. Endurance has found its voice. It speaks in the grammar of small victories and the denial of other people's plans. The last days of November grind like gears that almost agree. The corridor yawns open, closes, opens again with the reluctance of a mouth that distrusts the spoon. Tanks die in the same patches and are replaced by cousins who develop the same habits. A water truck reaches a forward box and becomes a sacrament. A captured mess tin is washed, renamed, and entered into the fortress's common law. The blade, having run to the limit of its fuel and fate, begins to discover that distance is not a single advantage, but a balance sheet with penalties in bold. Then, suddenly, as such things always seem in hindsight, the balance tips. The Afrika Korps, bled of tracked confidence and roadworthy certainty, eases back along the Via Balbia like a cat that has decided the kitchen is not interesting tonight. The frontier forts loosen their grips and change proprietors with fewer quarrels. Sidi Rezegh is held long enough for the argument to move west. Bir el Gubi becomes a word in the rear view. Tobruk, the insult in the puzzle, breathes in the open. Not deeply yet, but without interruption. The ferry continues, less haunted by urgent arithmetic, more by habit. The rats lift their heads and sniff a wind that carries a tincture of relief and a warning. This is not the end. This is a comma. You are invited to feel the complicated pride of a circle intact and a path reopened. Victory does not look like a parade. It looks like a lane through a minefield that teams now cross without holding their breath. It looks like wounded shipped out in daylight. It looks like anti-tank guns being dragged to new pits with grins that are mostly fatigue. The blade has not broken, it has blinked. The box has not walked away, it has stretched. The desert, unconcerned. Wrinkles under a cold that arrives stealthily, teaching men another grammar wind off the sea that smells of rust and damp wool. Stars that do not encourage warmth. Metal that burns fingers to teach patience. The last light of November slants across wrecks that have already begun to belong to no one. A sign at a post changes from not yet to still. The harbor's masts pencil in the dusk, and a single bell rings for reasons both practical and old. Tomorrow will bring pursuits and withdrawals, the politics of credit, the housekeeping of victory salvage, burial, repair. The box, however, has graduated from being merely surrounded to being a participant. The rats hold their city with a steadier grin. The blade, farther out, thinks about water more than about glory. The theater rearranges its props for the next act. December does not celebrate, it tidies, and the tidying looks like movement. The cordon around the harbor slackens into suggestion, then into rumor. The box, which had survived by breathing in measured sips, draws a steadier breath and discovers it has a voice beyond refusal. Out along the road where the sea keeps company, the long-range school writes its new lesson, backward retreat as distance, distance as hope. The Afrika Korps and its Italian partners slide west, feeling with antennae for the next defensible shelf of earth, leaving behind belts of mines like punctuation that refuses to let a sentence end clean. The fortress archetype, rat, wall, stubborn heartbeat, steps over its old boundary and becomes a traveler. You are not given trumpets, you are granted lanes. Pursuit does not feel like triumph. It feels like administration with a pulse. Along the Via Balbia, convoys move as if on a sewing machine, stitches of dust running toward names that used to belong to the other side. Solemn, Capuzzo, the twin Omars shrug on new owners without changing their bones. Halfaya, that sour lip of cliff the men have baptized hellfire, keeps its schoolmarm stare while new students learn the old rules. On the escarpments around Sidi Rezegh, the glare picks out wrecks so numerous they seem like a low-metal crop. Each has a lesson written on it in shrapnel. Grammar do not crest without a plan. Do not love momentum more than geometry. Do not confuse bravery with aim. Farther west, the map climbs into the Green Mountains and drops in lashes, roads twisting like handwriting practiced by tired hands. Derna's escarpment, Machili's dry invitation, and Mepsius's crossroads pretend to be incidental and are not. The Afrika Korps, expert at making horizon an ally, distrust corners. Every bend is a chance for a Porte silhouette to turn into a sentence. Fuel becomes the language that makes all this possible. The British columns learn. In the same breath they learn pursuit, the old catechism of tins and tables. Petrol sings in the lines at dawn and sulks in the lines at dusk. In that ebb and flood, the pursuit becomes a conversation rather than a chase. Tobruk's harbor, no longer a vein too close to the skin, keeps working like a well-run lung. The ferry continues out of habit and history, less haunted, more precise. Barges and destroyers offload not only ammunition and food, but parts for the future new barrels. Engines, rolls of tape, canvas, wire materials that promise a grammar shift from survival to initiative. The workshops, underground and salt-licked, begin to send things outward instead of barely keeping them alive within an anti-tank piece. With a new carriage finds itself on a flatbed with a grin of fresh paint. A Matilda with a transplanted heart thunders out to greet land that has only heard the voices of faster cousins. The box remembers itself as both house and forge. The blade does not disappear. It grows cautious. West of Gazala, a line half-formed in memory months ago tightens. It is not a fortress. It is a mood sand ridges, scrapes, guns tucked where the sun's angles keep secrets. The long-range doctrine pauses, checks its pocket watch, and concedes that reach without rest is merely a theory performed once. In that quiet, the British and Commonwealth recipe for advance so long in the composing thickens. Armored brigades press the road and the gravel flats. Infantry nibble at the little hills that decide large truths. Gunners set their 25s in arcs that can become walls when walls are needed. It is a new choreography learned with old muscles. You, who have watched patience make a city outlast arrows. Now watch pressure make the arrows hesitate. The rats adjust to open country with an earnestness that borders on odd. Men whose maps had been trench plans, annotated with jokes, now carry strip maps that run like weather reports. Wind from the sea, dust inland. Expect confusing wadis near noon. Humor turns outward. A sign at a newly claimed track junction points southeast and reads Cairo. Eventually, another is planted at the edge of a minefield and says Public Gardens. A captured water cart is christened with a name no mother ever gave a child and towed west with ceremony. The garrison's wit, honed by survival, turns triumph into something manageable, a resource rather than a myth. The air changes the key of its song. Where stukas had been metronomes of dread, kitty hawks and hurricanes begin to saw across the sky with a busier, more domestic tone. BF-109s thread among them in duels that feel like side stories, deadly and private. Pilots learn the anatomy of glare, the sudden geometry of wadis, the honest treachery of heat reflection. Men on the ground lift their heads to watch and lower them again because the ground syllabus still demands more of their attention. Bombs find roads, bombs miss roads. The lesson returns, persistence rubs the desert better than spectacle. Bardia and the cliff beyond yield like doors whose hinges were never designed for siege. The last garrisons at the frontier forts become carefully staged problems rather than terrors. Prisoners march the wrong direction under a sun that bleaches insignia into the blank of men. Some are Italians who carry the fatigue of a century. Some are Germans with a professional's tight jaw and a bewilderment he will not admit. Some are barely bearded youths who hold themselves with a fine imitation of their officers. All of them stare at the harbor when they pass and do not change expression. The box watches them go and refuses easy scorn. Siege teaches the poverty of hatred and its expense. Inside the moving columns, hunger and cold begin a duet. The coastal wind learns new teeth. Nights grow longer, the stars sharpening as if to cut. Men who learned to hoard water now learn to hoard warmth. Greatcoats travel from supply to shoulders like absolutions. Tea returns to its role as medicine. Engines, who loved summer in the way demons love conflagrations, discover sulks in the chill dawn. A fitter speaks to a magneto with the voice of a father pleading with a stubborn child. Winter in the desert is a lesson not often taught in films, the way metal grows cruel to touch, the way breath becomes visible and embarrasses the living, the way dew reminds men that water can be an edge as well as a balm. Somewhere beyond Agadabia, the blade makes it stand and then revises the definition of stand, sliding farther to a headland that smells of salt and weariness, El Aguila. The maps already know its value. The desert pretends indifference and then reveals, as always, the precise importance of a few ridges and salt pans. The long-range doctrine thins into size. Fuel lines grow brittle. Bearings long for grease that is still on a ship. The Afrika Korps, still dangerous when cornered, shows a narrower profile. Ariete carries bruises under its paint and a bitter pride under its insignia. The British columns, elated, cautious, awkward in their new role as chasers, gather at the edge of their own tables of organization. And there the year decides to change. A battle season closes like a ledger balanced, not like a curtain dramatically dropped. Crusaders' arithmetic has paid the box's debt. The ring is no longer a ring, it is a memory you can hold without flinching. The long-range thrust has demonstrated both the elasticity of doctrine and its limits reaches only sovereignty if you can afford the return journey. The fortress has revealed its secret name community, that way of moving through danger by distributing fear until no single man drowns. The rats who own the dugouts own the road in their portion, not with swagger, but with that humble increment that has always been their weapon. You are asked to sit with complexity. Relief does not erase grief. victory does not throttle fatigue. Graves beside the wire do not march west. They remain under stones stacked by hands that still smell of cordite. The harbor lights, which once trembled at the sound of aircraft, now tremble with tide and memory. The box has given the theater a new trope, a circle that learned to survive long enough to step out of itself. The blade has been reminded that genius requires fuel, and fuel requires mercy from distances and from fate. In the wake of the moving front, small economies unfold. A boy in a street near the mole tries to sell a soldier a bird cage without a bird. A baker returns to an oven that remembers heat as touch. Flour becomes a rumor and then a loaf. A line of camels picks its way through wire gaps as if taking part in a ritual that predates the quarrel by centuries. An Australian private, who once named every shell with a joke, sends a shell without a name toward a patch of scrub where a gun had been an hour ago. The explosion writes nothing and yet clears a space in the mind. Not all acts are consequential. Many are simply continuations of being. The campaign's archetypes step to the edge of the stage and bow without flourish. Fortress as patience learned, thrust as distance taxed, survival as art, humor as shield. Each has lost weight. Each has gained scars. Each will be needed again. The desert sweeps its palm across the map as if clearing crumbs. New labels begin to whisper Ghazala, Knightsbridge, Knightsbridge again. Cycles like seasons. But the box retains its emblem. Not a flag's roar, but a quiet, vicious grin learned under nets and in caves, the knowledge of how to be small for as long as it takes to be large enough. If you were looking for moral, you have collected tools instead. Rope and tape. A tin of peaches kept for a day when a man is almost not a man. The instinct to count, to mend, to aim when fear prefers noise. The habit of moving at night and being kind at dawn. The understanding that endurance can be an offensive, and reach, if careless, a siege. The rats taught this. The blade confirmed it. The winter honors it with cold stars. The sea restores its impatient glitter, and the road west draws a line that men will learn again too soon. The harbor snores like an old dog whose work is not done. A sign at a former post says closed for renovation, and makes more sense than it ought. The box has become story, a good one. Not because of fame, but because of function. The desert nods without kindness and waits for the next argument it intends to teach.